Hello and welcome to APAC Games Weekly episode 58. I am your host Connell Suter, and as we do every week, we'll be covering the biggest news stories of the past week from across the APAC games industries. Today we've got a couple of updates on stories we've covered previously and a couple of new ones. We'll be kicking off with a revisit to Nintendo Live's cancellation due to death threats, as a suspect has now been arrested. We'll then do a deeper dive than we have on previous episodes into why Japan isn't facing the mass layoffs of other markets. Following that, we'll talk about Ubisoft announcing APAC layoffs, and finally, game design degrees in Vietnam propelling the local industry. So, let's dive straight into the news about Nintendo Live. Suspect behind Nintendo Live Tokyo cancellation death threats arrested in Japan. You might remember at the start of the year that Nintendo had to cancel its 2024 Nintendo Live Tokyo event and postpone the Splatoon World Championship. All of this was due to death and, I believe, bomb threats being made by an unknown individual. Seemingly, they're now not so unknown, as Japanese police have said they have arrested a suspect who is a man in his 20s. All we know at the moment is that the man is actually a local government employee in the Ibaraki prefecture, and that he's been suspected of sending multiple death threats via the Nintendo official website's inquiry form. A really bizarre situation. As of right now, the motivation behind those messages is still unknown, and that's the part that is leaving people really puzzled. Of all companies, Nintendo often seems like the most well-known company to rarely, if ever, court really any level of controversy or player outrage. The initial cancellation left Nintendo fans stunned and disappointed. Of course, everybody who could travel to it wanted to go to the Nintendo Tokyo event, but I'm sure everyone understood that when we're talking about death threats, it just couldn't go on. Sadly though, even with this news about an arrest, there isn't an indication currently that the event will be rescheduled. Although, as we are only in April, it is possible that something may happen later in the year, but of course the postponed Splatoon Championship will take place. But fingers crossed that Nintendo do something at least in Tokyo for fans later in the year. Fingers crossed. Japan's game industry weathers the storm amid layoffs worldwide. Now, if you've been listening to the podcast over the last year, since the start, we kind of started the podcast during a load of layoff announcements, you've probably heard us talk before about how Japan has not only managed to avoid the mass layoffs that we've seen across Western markets and companies, but actually increasing the salaries and things like that for people there. It's incredibly noticeable if you've been paying attention, and it isn't just one company increasing salaries. If you remember, Nintendo, Capcom, pretty much every major Japanese games company has increased salaries for at least for new starts, and sometimes even for all employees. It's pretty crazy. This was all after the Japanese government actually asked companies to pay people more to help with the cost of living crisis. So it's a very interesting situation. Well, now, because of this continued success of the Japanese industry to avoid layoffs and the continued failure of Western companies to do the same thing, has meant that you see a lot more major publications talking about this now. Japan Times spoke to a number of people involved in the Japanese games industry with some great responses that do help shed some light on why this is happening that are worth talking about. Japan Times spoke to Shingo Inui, apologies if I'm mispronouncing that, who is a partner at Bain & Company, who work in the games industry, and he talked about how the video game market has become oversaturated, especially in the West, and this is why companies are struggling to maintain consistent revenue streams, quote, especially if their games fail to meet sales expectations, end quote. Layoffs then follow. We'll talk a little bit more about something relevant to that in the next story, but for the moment, the article is really worth reading and does a good job of covering how the news we discussed over the last year has felt in very direct contrast to news from the West. On the same day that you would literally be seeing these stories about Capcom increasing salaries, you would have a story right beside it about a major Western company laying off even hundreds of employees. It is impossible not to see the difference. Japan Times also spoke to Serkan Toto, who's head of Tokyo-based Kantan Games, who are a games consultancy company. He had a number of interesting comments, including, quote, Japanese companies are actually doing the exact opposite of what the games companies or direct competitors in the West are doing, unquote. He went on to say, for some reason not in a quoted format, that Japanese companies actually have the opposite issue at the moment, even in a grander sense, and the difficulty is attracting and retaining talent, which is completely the opposite, obviously, of the problems we're seeing in the West. One interesting thing to think about there is that is a broader reflection of the problem with the Japanese population, which is they have a massively aging population without very much immigration. So there isn't people to fill that space, and because Japan's very expensive to live in, a lot of young people either don't have kids or maybe have one child and things like this. So it kind of makes sense that they actually have difficulties with retaining talent. Of course, how this then fits in with global layoffs compared to their industry, how these people laid off in Western markets, would they go to Japan? It's unlikely, and that's interesting in itself. Back to the article, Toto went on to say, quote, looking at the future of the Japanese gaming industry, it's quite optimistic because they have weathered the storm after Corona much, much better than Western competitors. I think there's still going to be big layoffs in the video game industry in the West. It's not the end yet. End quote. Unfortunately, as we'll cover in the next story, he is not wrong about that. But what he doesn't mention is that those layoffs don't just affect the West. Ubisoft lays off 45 more people in their APAC and global publishing divisions. So unfortunately, today GameSpot have reported that Ubisoft will be laying off 45 more people from the mentioned APAC and global publishing divisions. Ubisoft themselves released a statement that read, quote, over the past few months, every team within Ubisoft has been exploring ways to streamline our operations and enhance our collective efficiency so that we are better positioned for success in the long term. In this context, today we announced that we are further reorganizing our global publishing central and APAC structures to adapt them to the market evolution with a more efficient and agile approach. Those changes will impact 45 positions overall. These are not decisions taken lightly, and we are providing comprehensive support for our impacted colleagues. We also want to share our utmost gratitude and respect for their many contributions to the company. End quote. Now, of course, hearing that, it doesn't come off super well. I think the reason being that it comes off as incredibly corporate in the things they're saying, and more that they're talking about enhancing our collective efficiency and a more efficient and agile approach, as opposed to kind of talking about the reality of it and instead kind of positioning it as if it's like, oh, we want to do this to make it more efficient, as opposed to saying we need to cut costs. Understandable that they don't say it that literally, but at the same time, there's a slightly bitter taste left in the mouth from quite how corporate that comes across. It's also worth remembering in this context that Ubisoft has studios across many APAC countries. Those include India, Japan, Vietnam, the Philippines, China, and of course, Singapore. Exactly where these layoffs are happening isn't directly mentioned, but we will likely hear or at least see more of the specifics as they happen. Of course, this news cannot be separated from the disappointing release of Skull and Bones earlier this year, which was primarily developed in their Singapore studio. The game was, let's be honest, a financial and critical failure, and as we're now at the beginning of the new financial year, it's likely that this was the straw that broke the camel's back, as it were. An interesting thing to note here, that's mentioned in a lot of these stories when they talk about this, is that Singapore have actually been working on Skull and Bones in that studio for 10 years. It hasn't moved around lots of teams like a lot of games do. It really has been there. The crazy thing is that they were actually given this project because they did some really good work on Assassin's Creed Black Flag with the naval combat physics and systems. But that was years ago. I mean, that game came out in 2013, so it becomes this strange question of almost none of that team would still even be there. And with these layoffs, of course, even fewer will likely still be working there, which is a sad situation. It is interesting though, I think, to compare this story with the quotes in the previous one about Japan avoiding layoffs. Of course, this isn't a Japanese company, this is a Western company with a studio in Japan that may face layoffs, but it's likely that those laid off there would have a completely different situation to those laid off pretty much across all Western markets, because they're going to be the only people involved in this kind of wave of mass layoffs that are in Japan. And as we've just heard, the biggest difficulty for Japanese companies is actually bringing talent and retaining it. These people are now just free real estate for those companies. So I imagine anyone who's possibly facing layoffs there would actually be in a far more positive situation to pretty much anywhere else in the world, which is interesting to think about. And just to finish off the story, of course, everyone at APAC Games Weekly and ECI Games just feels awful every time we see one of these news stories, and our thoughts are with everybody being laid off, and fingers crossed they're able to find a great new job within the games industry. And for our final story of the day, game design degrees in Vietnam expected to boost industry growth. So we're back in Vietnam for a quick update on some of the movements being made in the industry to help secure its future success. You might remember some of the stories we talked about last year with the Vietnamese games industry, where there was a lot of back and forth between industry specialists, people in the government, and trying to work out this sort of new deal. They wanted to add special consumption taxes to games, and instead they kind of went the exact opposite way and actually really focused on helping the games industry and boosting it further with an aim to grow it to a really high extent. That extent is pretty lofty, as the government seemed to have done a complete 180, and the Ministry of Information and Communications, shortened to the MIC, who is in charge of a lot of this and were the people talking about the special consumption tax, have said that they aim to increase the industry's revenue to $1 billion USD by 2027. So an interesting thing that comes up in this story about the Vietnamese games industry, and it's an important distinction to notice, is that most of the developers working at Vietnamese games companies come from non-games backgrounds. These are often IT, software design, and graphic design. This is something that the MIC wants to change with more dedicated games courses. In January of this year, Sconnect, who are a tech company, opened the Sconnect Academy of Media Arts, shortened to SAMA, which specializes in animation and game design. At the very same time, FPT Polytechnic College announced that its 2-year game programming course will be open for enrollment starting this year. On top of that even, the Posts and Telecommunications Institute of Technology, shortened to PTIT, is now running an undergraduate degree in game design, which is expected to have 200 students in its first cohort, which will take place this year. So as you can see from those, they're not just 3 good games courses, but they all cover slightly different areas of game development. I don't know if that was synchronized by these institutions, but it's a really good idea. Of course, you've got animation with game design at Sconnect, you've got programming specifically at the Polytechnic College, and then you've got game design in a larger degree, it sounds like, from PTIT. So it's a really good idea. It's a really, really solid thing. These are all pretty big movements, really, and the aim of them is to propel Vietnam's games industry to new, lofty heights, which can only be a good thing for everybody. Many countries around the world have already seen huge amounts of success from promoting game-specific courses. Of course, I went to Abertay University in Dundee, Scotland, which was the first university in the world to offer game-specific courses. And since then, many of the people that went there work at huge companies, including Rockstar and those outside of the country. It's a fantastic way of getting people into games as a dedicated way, though there is some questions, perhaps, about how that employs you for other industries, and in the same way as software designers being able to move into games, can you do vice versa? It's likely that as we go on, we'll see more and more specialized courses and people in the games industry really studying very specific things that lead to specific jobs. as opposed to being extremely broad software to games, etc. It's going to be fascinating to see how this evolves the Vietnamese games industry, and we hope to talk about it on future episodes. But more on that in a minute. And that was it for APAC Games Weekly episode 58. As always, thank you so much for listening. I hugely appreciate it, and I do hope you found these stories interesting. We have something else to announce at the end of this episode, which is that episode 60 will be, at least for the moment, our final episode. We will be taking an indefinite hiatus after that point, and we may revisit the show in the future and make new episodes, but that is a little bit up in the air at the moment. Thank you so much for listening if you've been with us for a while, and even if not, thank you for listening to a couple of episodes. I love making APAC Games Weekly, so I really hope that there's a time in the future where it makes sense to revisit the show, but it just doesn't at the moment. But that's episode 60, so we've still got a couple more episodes until then. Well, I guess actually you've got 2 more episodes for the moment, but I hope you join us for them, and I will be excited to make them. We will be back for episode 59, our penultimate episode for the moment, next Monday, same time, same place, YouTube, Spotify, 12 PM GMT on Monday. I hope you join us then. Until then, I hope you have a great week.